Okay, we're going to get started. So we're going to talk about the nervous system today. And before we get started, I want to shout out Ananya and Aisha for winning first place at our past quizzes sessions. Everyone else did super awesome. So proud of you guys. I know this is super hard stuff to learn in like 1 hour, and you guys are doing awesome. So we're going to have a quizzes today too. Okay, so we're going to go over basically the summary that we always go over of what the nervous system is. We're going to go over some of the functions. We're going to go over what neurons are, their structures, and the different types of neurons. We're going to go over the central nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, different sensations related to the nervous system, medical roots, and then we're going to finish it all off with diseases and conditions. So first up, we're going to go over the summary. What is the nervous system? So like we talked about, the central nervous system has two parts. The nervous system has two parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system, when I say that, what do you guys think about? Like central, what comes into mind? Main, yeah. So like the central nervous system is the main part of the entire nervous system, and it is consisted of the two most important things in your body, the brain and the spinal cord. The next system that we have is the peripheral nervous system, which has its own parts that we're going to go over later, but the peripheral nervous system controls voluntary and involuntary responses of our body and detects and processes sensory information. So what the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves that do not make up the central nervous system. So anything that's not in the brain and the spinal cord. So everything in our arms, our faces, our legs, our abdominal area, our thoracic area, all of those go into the peripheral nervous system. So let's go over them. What is the nervous system? So let's watch this short video. It's going to be like 30 seconds. I've divided this video up so we can just see the most important parts when we talk about them. So let me know if you guys can hear this video. Let's see how it goes. Can you guys hear it? I'm going to pause it for 2 seconds. Oops. You can't hear it. You guys didn't hear that? Okay, give me a second. Yeah, so does anyone know where to go to the computer audio? Let me see. Okay, hold on. Let me figure this out. Because this video is super cool, and I think you guys will actually like it. Okay, I see it. All right. Okay. All right, let me know if you hear it now. Do you guys hear that?
Today, we will talk about an organ that rules all of our body, and that is our brain. As it is the most sensitive organ, our brain is kept inside a bony covering called skull. From doing physical activity to solving logical problems, from dealing with emotions and feeling to creativity, the brain is responsible for all. Therefore, it never sleeps.
Okay, so that's the first section that No. Okay. So now we're going to talk about everything that they just said. So the functions of the nervous system include sensory input. So what we get from our surroundings, like if we touch something hot or if something's going on inside our body, we send electrical impulses throughout our nervous system, throughout our peripheral nervous system and central nervous system, up to our brain. And our brain basically integrates all the information. It gets our sensory input, it decides what to do with it, and then it sends information back out to our body. We have motor output. So basically what that is when our body, when our brain sends the input out, telling our body what to do, the impulses travel to your peripheral nervous system, and it travels to your muscles. It makes your muscles contract. It basically tells the body what to do with this specific piece of information. And the impulses travel from the brain to our organs and muscles, and that's when they carry out a specific function. So let's go over some fun facts. They're going to be all throughout this presentation, but this is number one. There are more nerve cells in the human brain than there are stars in the Milky Way, and I think that's awesome because I'm kind of a nerd, and there are a lot of stars in the Milky Way. We have a lot of nerve cells in our body. So, like we talked about, we have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system is basically made up of our brain and spinal cord, and it contains oligodendrocytes. We're going to talk about that later. And it is hard to make new nerve cells in our brain, and in our spine, it's impossible. So what do you guys think happens when the nerves in our spine are damaged? What does that result in? You get paralyzed. Yeah. So that's what happens when the nerves in your spine are damaged, because it's impossible to repair them. But in the peripheral nervous system, we can repair our nerve cells. So basically what the peripheral nervous system is all of the nerves outside of the CNS, every nerve outside of the brain and spinal cord. It contains Schwann cells, so we're going to go over that later. You can also make new nerve cells. So like when you get a bad burn, and maybe it's a 3rd-degree burn, so the nerves in your skin are being damaged. You have nerve endings, you have a lot of stuff. We're going to go over that later. So when all that stuff gets damaged, we still have to feel in our skin, right? So that's how our body regenerates. We make new nerve cells, it repairs those nerve cells, and we have billions and billions of nerve cells. So it's not like a 3rd-degree burn, I'm pretty sure, is when it goes to the deepest layers of your skin. It's bad. It would definitely damage your nerves. So we're going to go over what basically those 2 types of nervous systems are. You'll see them in like more of a visual form.
Brain comes under a system called nervous system. Structurally, nervous system is classified into 2 types: central nervous system, CNS, and peripheral nervous system, PNS. The central nervous system comprises of the brain and spinal cord. The spinal cord is the bridge that connects the brain to peripheral nervous system. It starts from medulla oblongata and stretches to lumbar region of the spine or vertebral column. The peripheral nervous system is a network of nerves spread across our body. Think of peripheral nervous system as a network of highway that connects the body with central nervous system. This highway has two-way traffic.
Okay, so that was like more of a visual form. I really liked how they said the peripheral nervous system was kind of like a highway, because really you really have 2 parts of your peripheral nervous system. You have afferent and efferent neurons. So we're going to go over that too. Okay, neuron structure and types. So we're going to go over the basic structure of a neuron, and the one that I'm going to go over is a multipolar neuron. We're going to go over the rest later. Okay, so what neurons are, they're basically the basic unit of structure and function, and they conduct impulses throughout our body. The first part of our neuron is the dendrites. They receive impulses and give it to our cell body. Our cell body is called the soma. So the dendrites are basically like the little things branching out from that big bunch. And then the soma is kind of everything inside. So kind of like where you see the little circles, the little ovals, that's basically the actual cell body. It contains all of the organelles and it conducts all of the functions that a regular cell does. Next, we have the axon. It comes out of the cell body. It carries the signal away from the cell body, the soma. It takes it away from the soma, and it gives it to the axon terminals. And what axon terminals do is that they branch out to the other cells. So, for example, there is an electrical impulse going throughout your body. It has to reach your fingers. So what it does, it just jumps around from the dendrites to the soma, to the axon terminals, and to the next cell's dendrites. So that is how our neurons transfer information. And they do it so fast. Like when you burn yourself, you immediately feel it, right? That burn, you're feeling that burn as an electrical impulse all the way from the tips of your fingers to your brains and all the way back down, telling you what to do. You basically have to move your finger away from the burn. So that's an example. Okay, so they're going to explain what neurons are.
Here, you hear the word neuron. Neuron is the basic unit of nervous system. It is the nerve cell which transmit electrical signals to brain. A neuron has three parts: dendrites, soma or cell body, and axon. Dendrites serve as input device for neuron because it receives input from other nerve cells. Soma or cell body of neuron contains nucleus. Axons serve as output device from where it transmit electrical response to other neurons.
Okay, so that's kind of how like electrical impulses look while they're going through your neurons. So now we're going to talk about the different types of neurons and how they correlate in our central nervous system and our peripheral nervous system. So first, I'm going to take the brain example because that's the best. So our sensory neurons, what do you think sensory neurons do? Are they the first responders or the last responders to get information? When they get information, are they the first to know about that information or are they the last? What do you think? They're the first. So you're burning your hand, your sensory neurons are receiving that impulse. They're the first people on the scene, your sensory neurons. They're basically the afferent neurons, and they travel all throughout the body to the central nervous system, where the interneurons are. So the interneurons, where do you think they are? What two organs are the interneurons in? The brain and the spinal cord, because those are the only two organs inside of the central nervous system. So the interneurons, when I hear that, I kind of think like between. So they're between kind of our brain and the rest of our body. They're relaying messages. And then we have, lastly, motor neurons. So when our brain gets that impulse from the afferent neurons, the sensory neurons, it does something, whatever the brain does, it does its magic and it says, okay, I got this information, here's what I want to do. And it sends that information, it sends that decision to our motor neurons through afferent neurons. So basically, that impulse is going from your brain through efferent neurons, and it's reaching your motor neurons, and then it tells your body what to do, how to respond. So if that means your muscles contracting, your bones are moving, you're moving away from the burn. So like I said, afferent sensory neurons carry the impulses from inside and outside your body to the CNS, to your spinal cord. And in your spinal cord, the interneurons send the messages up to your brain, and then they send it, they get the signals from the brain and they send it back down to the rest of the body through efferent neurons, which are also called motor neurons. So what motor neurons do is that they receive impulses from the central nervous system. Oh, so afferent basically means it's sending it to the CNS, and then efferent is getting it from the CNS. So just think of it like that. Okay, so like I talked about before, there are three kinds of different neurons. So the one we went over is multipolar, but they're all basically the same thing. They just have everything in different places. So the unipolar, what do you think that means? Uni. One. And what do you think bi means, like in bipolar? Two. And then multipolar. Multipolar would be more than two, multiple. So in unipolar neurons, we have our cell body, our soma, and the only thing it touches is the axon. And then we have the axon terminals branching out. And then in bipolar neurons, we have the soma in the middle, and then we have axons, two axons running from each end. So it's kind of like encased within the axons. And then we have the axon terminals just branching out at the ends. And then, like we talked about in multipolar neurons, we have our axons covered by the dendrites, and they have one long kind of channel called the axon, and then that branches out into the axon terminals. Does everyone get all of this so far? Okay, great. Okay, so now we're going to go over kind of more about interneurons and different parts of neurons and what exactly they do. So interneurons, like I said, are in the brain and the spinal cord. And afferent neurons, or sensory neurons, travel impulses. They give impulses to the interneurons, which are in the CNS, and the interneurons bring the impulses back down to the efferent neurons, or also the motor neurons. We call them the motor neurons as well, because they are actually doing the movement that the brain tells them to do. So like we talked about, dendrites are the parts of the neurons which receive communications from other cells, basically where the axon terminal meets them, and that's where the impulses jump from one neuron to the next. Then we have the axon terminal, which basically attaches on to the axon of one cell to the dendrites of another cell. And they're responsible for providing that kind of joint between the two neurons. They also contain neurotransmitters, which are basically chemicals that relay the messages that the brain is trying to tell the body to do. And then we have the myelin sheath. Basically, it's insulation. It allows impulses to move quickly. So when you have a charger, do you just have wires sticking out? You just touch the wires and plug it into your phone? Or is there like a coating around the wires? Yeah, so basically that coating, that insulation, is the myelin sheath in the neurons. And we're going to talk about the different cells that make up the myelin sheath. So again, typical structure of the typical neuron, we have our dendrites, and we have our soma, and inside the soma we have that little green thing called a nucleus. And then attaching to the soma we have the axon, basically the long strip, and we have Schwann cells and the myelin sheath, which is kind of like the light green, kind of lime green little ovals that cover the axon. And we have the nodes of Ranvier. We're going to talk about that later. And then finally, we have the axon terminals. Okay, so nodes of Ranvier are basically sections of axons that are not covered by the myelin sheaths. So those little blue spaces that you see between the lime green ovals, that's the nodes of Ranvier. And basically what they do is that they allow the electrical impulses to jump and conduct faster. It's also called saltatory conduction. So they move faster with the nodes of Ranvier. We have Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes, and combined with the nodes of Ranvier, they basically speed up, protect, and insulate our neurons. We also have something called neuroglial cells, which glue cells together, and they hold the neurons. They basically hold the neurons together. So the axon terminals connecting to the dendrites are kind of touching and combined together, held together by the neuroglial cells. So the word glial kind of means glue. So if you ever see that anywhere, just know that it means glue. And then neuro means having to do with the nervous system. So the cells that glue parts of the nervous system together. They're basically the support system for the nervous system. Okay, now we're going to talk about the cells that form the myelin sheath. I just uncovered this a little blue part. I didn't want you guys to focus on that while I was talking about the other things. So basically what Schwann cells are is they form the myelin sheath and they wrap around the axon. So those little green things that you see are the Schwann cells. Actually, I'm sorry, the little red things inside the green things are the Schwann cells. They're inside the myelin sheath. And the oligodendrocytes are an insulating sheath of the axons of nerve fibers. So those are different. So basically, Schwann cells and oligodendrocytes combined with the nodes of Ranvier, again, speed up, protect, and insulate our neurons. Okay, I covered some parts up by blue, so you guys wouldn't focus on that part. I felt like it was easier for me to focus on one thing and better explain it. I hope it works. Let me know. Okay, so microglia. So it's a form of an immune cell in our nervous system. It is the first and main form of active immune defense. So it is a first responder. So if there is some kind of blockage or something that the immune system needs to respond to, it sends microglia there first. It basically clears up anything that's dead or blocking the nervous system from sending impulses, and it does that through phagocytosis. So phago in biology means eating. So, and cytosis means having to do with the cell. So it's basically the cell is intaking all of this debris and dead neurons, and it's basically using enzymes to break them down and remove them from our nervous system, from our nervous tissue. Very, very important. We have astrocytes, so astro, star. So star-shaped. Astrocytes are star-shaped immune cells, and what they do is that they regulate our metabolism, how much energy our neurons consume. They also have electrical insulation for unmyelinated axons. So if there are some neurons that don't have a myelin sheath, they help protect them, and they help transport bloodborne material to the neuron, and they are there when there is a reaction to an injury. And then lastly, we have ependymal cells. They make up the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, and they protect the brain and the spine when moving. So cerebrospinal fluid is in your cranial cavity and your spinal cord, and it protects it. So like the heart, everything in the thoracic area can move. It needs to move. Like your lungs need to move, your heart needs to move. I talked about this before. Your brain and your spinal cord cannot move. So what cerebrospinal fluid does, it helps protect the brain and the spine when you're moving around. And what ependymal cells do is that they make up that cerebrospinal fluid. So again, very, very helpful. Okay, so fun fact number 2, if we have so many neurons in our body, like we talked about earlier, and if we lined them all up, if we lined up all the neurons in our body, the whole string would be about 965 kilometers long, which is very, very, very long. And I think that's awesome that we're able to fit all that in our body. Okay, now we're going to talk about the central nervous system. So central nervous system, what is it made up of? What are the 2 organs in the central nervous system? The brain and the spinal cord. So let's go over. So this is going to be a lot of jam-packed information, but don't worry, you guys got this. A lot of this is kind of related to the muscular system and the skeletal system. You'll hear very, very similar names. So you got this. Okay, parts of the brain. Let's watch a little clip first before we start.
Our brain can be divided into 3 main parts: the cerebrum, the cerebellum, and brainstem. Cerebrum is the largest part of brain, which can be further divided into right and left halves, called hemisphere. Each cerebral hemisphere has 4 lobes, namely frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Each lobe performs different functions. Cerebellum is responsible for movement and coordination. It gives you sense of balance and thus prevents you from falling down. Brainstem includes midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. It controls your body's involuntary actions like breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure.
Okay, now we're going to go over all of these things and in detail. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to go over is the cerebrum. So what the cerebrum does, So what the cerebrum does is it coordinates all the activities of our body. That's the function basically of the whole brain. But the cerebrum basically goes in deeper. It controls memory, intelligence, and muscles. So different parts of the brain control different things. So we have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Do you guys remember that from the muscular and skeletal systems, those words, frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal? Yeah, so these things carry over because they're talking about essentially the same place. So our brain actually controls our heart rate, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, so first we're going to go over the frontal lobes. The frontal lobe is kind of the red area in the diagram. What it does is that it controls reasoning, our thought process, how we behave, all of our memories, and our motor functions, which is controlled in our precentral gyrus. So that's what it does. Our frontal lobe is kind of like the main action. So like anything related to school is probably going to very much involve the frontal lobe. So when you're doing your homework, the frontal lobe is involved. Parietal lobes, what that is in charge of is touch and sensory information. And that is all controlled in the postcentral gyrus. Don't worry about what the postcentral and precentral gyrus are. Just know that the parietal lobe is kind of in charge of sensory information. And we have the occipital lobe, which is basically in charge of vision. So I like how, I think it's really interesting that the occipital lobe is all the way at the back of our head, but it controls our eyes, it controls our vision all the way from back there. Our brain is very, very amazing. And then lastly, we have the temporal lobes. So our temporal lobes are right by our ears. I mean, the green part that you see, those are our temporal lobes. So what they do is they basically control our hearing. Okay, so like we talked about, the brain has two parts, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So what the right hemisphere is kind of responsible for is, something I want to talk about before we start going into this. So the right part of our brain, our right hemisphere, controls everything in the left side of our body. Who thinks that's weird? The right hemisphere controls everything in the left side of your body. The brain decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to move all of my neurons to this side through my pons and say, okay, the right's going to control the left and the left's going to control the right. So what the right hemisphere does is it controls the left side of the body, and it's the more artistic and creative side of the brain. And what the left hemisphere does is it controls the right side of the body and is the more academic and logical side of the brain. Arna, you've heard this before? When I learned it, I think it was medical terminology, I for sure on the test probably wouldn't have remembered which side controlled which. Okay, longitudinal fissure basically separates the left and the right hemisphere. So basically that little line in the middle you see, I mean, very big line, it's a big deal. That is the longitudinal fissure. It separates two sides of our brains and two sides of our bodies. Okay, so now we're gonna go over kind of like the grooves that we see in our brain, like the different like folded parts, the bended parts, the lines, everything. So we have three main areas, the gyrus, the sulcus, and the fissure. So what a gyrus is basically like a hill or a lump. They're the raised parts of the brain. A sulcus is kind of like the valleys. They're little lines. And then we have fissures. which are basically deep valleys in the brain. And the central sulcus is one of the most important parts, and it separates the frontal and parietal lobes. Okay, so we talked about the cerebrum. Now we're going to go over what the cerebellum does. So the cerebellum is kind of like that little part, not really little, it's the part kind of like just hanging off of your brainstem. It's right next to your pons. We're going to go over what the pons are later. So what the cerebellum does is it controls muscle coordination. It regulates your balance, your posture, and your muscle tone. So it is below the cerebrum, and it is above our first vertebra. So the cerebellum in this diagram is kind of the yellow golden part, and it controls, the most important thing to know is it controls muscle coordination. And inside, kind of like between, inside of the cerebrum area, we have our diencephalon, which contains the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the thalamus, and the pineal gland. Someone talked about the hippocampus and how it was important, so we're going to go over that. I wonder what it does. Okay, first on our list, the hippocampus. So basically what it does is stores memory, and I think that is super, super important. So always remember your diencephalon contains the most important parts of your brain, and the hippocampus stores your memory. Next we have the thalamus, which directs sensory impulses to our cerebrum and regulates our consciousness. So the diencephalon is basically that purple part that you see kind of right in the middle of the brain. So all of the stuff I'm talking about right now is stuffed into that purple part. Everything that is important to us, what that makes up who we are, is stuffed into the middle of our brain, in our diencephalon. The pituitary gland is basically the master gland, and it controls the hormones in our body. So it controls all of the production of the hormones in our pancreas. It is the master gland. So pituitary gland, always remember hormones. It controls all the hormones in our body, and our body cannot work without hormones. So it is very, very important. The hypothalamus regulates temperature, how we feel temperature. It regulates our appetite, our water, how much water we intake and where all that water goes, our balance, how much we sleep, our sleep cycles, and it controls the contraction and dilation of our blood vessels. Hypothalamus is very, very important as well. All of this stuff, very important. And lastly, we have the pineal gland. It's very, very small. It's a pea-shaped gland in our brain, in our diencephalon, which regulates hormones like melatonin, which controls our sleep patterns in circadian rhythms. Another name for circadian rhythms is sleep patterns. So just know our circadian rhythms are basically our sleep patterns, and jet lag is basically when our sleep patterns are mixed up, our circadian rhythms have some kind of imbalance, and yeah, fun fact. Okay, next part and the last part, we have the brain stem, which contains the pons, midbrain, and medulla oblongata. And it controls everything that's involuntary in our body. So all of this stuff is very, very important as well. Medulla oblongata especially very, very important. Okay, so the first part we have is the midbrain. It controls our eye and auditory reflexes. We have our pons, which is basically reflex reactions and fight or flight. We release fight or flight hormones. We're going to talk about that later in the peripheral nervous system. It's basically responsible for chewing, tasting, salivating, and it basically receives stimulus from nerves in the right side of our body, and it gets processed in the left side of our body, like we talked about earlier with the right and left hemispheres, and vice versa. So right side of our body goes to the left side of our brain, left side of our body goes to the right side. And lastly, we have the medulla oblongata, which controls our breathing and our heartbeat. So our heart is controlled by electrical impulses that we receive from our brain. And sometimes there can be a problem with that, and we require something that's called a pacemaker. So that's very interesting. And also something that I learned recently in high school was that our heart can actually control. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Basically, I don't know, what was I talking about? So our heart, even when our heart stops receiving signals from our brain, it can actually continue to beat because we have that natural pacemaker in our heart. Okay, sorry about that. Someone keeps calling me. Actually. Okay. Okay, so the last part, brain ventricles. What they do is they store and circulate our cerebrospinal fluid. What did I tell you guys about cerebrospinal fluid? What is it? What is the importance of cerebrospinal fluid in our body? It protects the spine and the brain. Very, very important because our brain and spine cannot move. Okay, fun fact number 3. There are about 100 billion neurons in your brain alone. 100 billion in your brain alone. That is amazing. Okay, spinal cord time. So basically, the spinal cord is from the end of our brainstem, basically the end of our medulla oblongata, to our conus medullaris. We're going to go over what that is later. And it has 4 parts like we talked about earlier, like the parts of our vertebrae. We have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. And the cervical region contains 8 nerves, but it has 7 bones. Our thoracic region has 12 nerves and 12 bones. Our lumbar region has 5 nerves and 5 bones, and our sacral region has 5 nerves and 5 bones. So, and how they're named is kind of confusing, but the cervical is different from the rest of the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. So how the cervical nerves are numbered is they're named above the vertebra. So if so basically, C1 nerve is above the C1 bone, and our C2 nerve would be between our C1 and our C2. And for our thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions, we have our nerves named below our vertebra. So the T1 nerve is below our T1 bone. Who counted? A lot of people, I'm sure. It can get confusing when you're naming nerves in your spinal cord, but just remember the cervical is different from the thoracic, lumbar, and sacral regions. And then of course we have the nerve in our coccyx. It's called the coccygeal nerve, and we only have one of them. It's basically our tailbone. Okay, so like we talked about, our spinal cord goes all the way to our conus medullaris, which starts at the lumbar 1 level. So basically, right below the light pink area. That's where our conus medullaris is, and that is where our actual spinal cord ends. And then we just have nerve fibers hanging off from there. So it's basically at the end of our spinal cord. The rest of our spine has nerve fibers, like I said, from L1 to the end. So from our, basically our lumbar region all the way down to our coccyx, we have nerve fibers instead of actual nerves. And then we have the cauda equina. Basically, it's where the spinal cord ends in the lumbar spine, and it's in charge of motor and sensory functions in the legs, intestines, genitals, and bladder. So it's basically just like a bunch of strands, and it looks like a horse's tail. So that's why we call it the cauda equina. It's Latin for horse's tail. And lastly, we have discs, which are the area between each vertebrae. I think I can show you guys the discs. So basically, if you look between each vertebrae, each of the colors, there's this white area. That's where our discs are, the area between each vertebrae. Okay. Okay. We have something called a meninges, which is basically the membrane that protects our brain and our spinal cord, and it has three main layers. We have the dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. So the dura mater basically is the gray outer layer of the spinal cord and the nerve roots. It's made of strong connective tissue. It's right below the skull. And we have the arachnoid mater, which is basically a web of arteries and veins. It is thinner than the layer above it. It is thinner than the dura. And below it, we have the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So when I say arachnoid, what does that remind you of? Arach. Spiders. Yeah, so it's kind of like spider-like. It's a web of arteries and veins. Okay. And lastly, we have the pia mater, which is the innermost layer. It is highly vascular. What does highly vascular mean? Highly vascular? What do you guys think that means? No one? Vascular? Yeah, it's something that has to do with the heart. So when I say highly vascular, I mean it has a lot of blood vessels in it, and it provides blood to all of the neural structures. It provides blood to your brain. It provides blood to your spinal cord. Very, very important. Okay, time for fun fact number 4. Okay, a newborn baby's brain almost triples in size during the course of its first year. Okay, now we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous systems, and I think we're going to have a clip real soon. I think it's on the next slide. Okay, so parts of the peripheral nervous system.
Vertebral column. The peripheral.
Oops. Oh, go back. Okay, sorry.
Vertebral column. The peripheral nervous system is a network of nerves spread across our body. Think of peripheral nervous system as a network of highway that connects the body with central nervous system. This highway has two-way traffic. Let's see how. When you hold a hot cup of coffee, sensory neurons in your hand transmit signal to brain through sensory neurons, also called afferent neurons, that the cup is hot. Your brain processes that information and send response through motor neurons, known as efferent neurons, that you must put that cup back. PNS consists of total 43 pairs of nerve, among which 12 originate in brain, named as cranial nerves, and 31 originate from spinal cord, hence called as spinal nerves.
Okay.
Vertebral column.
Okay, so our peripheral nervous system is made up of many different parts, but the two main parts of it are called the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system, it's basically relays information between the skin and the muscles and the central nervous system, and the autonomic nervous system basically relays our impulses from our brain and spinal cord to our organs, and everything in the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. So what would make you think it was involuntary in the first place? What in the word autonomic makes you think involuntary? What root? Yes, auto. So automatically, involuntary. Okay, and the autonomic nervous system has two parts called the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So what the sympathetic nervous system does is it basically controls our fight and flight responses in times of stress, and our parasympathetic nervous system controls our sleep. It also calms the body down to conserve and maintain energy. So something interesting is sympathetic. It basically makes the body react fast, and the parasympathetic kind of calms it down and conserves our energy. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the main nerves in our peripheral nervous system. So we have two types that we talked about before. Afferent nerves, what did we call them earlier? It started with an S. Sensory. Yeah, so they're also called sensory nerves. And what sensory nerves do is that they recognize sensory stimulus. And information from our afferent nerves is sent to our spine, our central nervous system. And from our central nervous system, from our spinal cord, it is sent to our brain. And what the efferent nerves do is basically when our brain receives the signals, it interprets it and it sends instructions back down to the spinal cord, which sends the instructions through efferent nerves to a specific organ or muscle. So it's kind of like a relay race with a bunch of neurons just happening super, super fast. Okay, we're going to talk about cranial nerves. Now, this slide may be very, very hefty, but it's very simple, and you don't have to memorize these. Just get to know that these are the nerves in your face. Okay, so first up, we have the olfactory nerve. Olfactory, just recognize that word. It means sense, anything to do with the brain, the nose really. So we have olfactory bulbs as well inside of our nasal cavity. And what they do is that they get the stimulus from the nose and they send it to the olfactory nerve, and that's how we have our sense of smell. Second, we have our optic nerves. Actually, we have two of them, and they basically control our vision. They go from the back of our eyes all the way to the occipital lobe, which is at the back of the brain. We have the oculomotor nerve, which basically moves our eye inside of our eye socket. So oculo, eye, motor, move, so movement of the eye. We have the trochlear nerve, which basically moves the eye as well. It's responsible for a different type of movement. So the ocular motor is responsible for maybe up and down movements, and the trochlear is responsible for left to right. And the trigeminal nerve basically brings sensation to the face. Again, it's a very, very important nerve. The abducens control left to right movement of the eye. So I was wrong before. So ocular motor, trochlear, and abducens all control movement of the eyes. We have the facial nerves, which basically control facial movements, like you want to smile, raise your eyebrows. It controls all of that. We have the vestibulocochlear nerve, which is basically part of your ear. It's responsible for balance and hearing. We're going to go over that later. It's super interesting. And we have the glossopharyngeal nerve, which basically is responsible for swallowing. We have the vagus nerve, which directs signals to internal organs. We have the accessory nerve, which helps move our shoulders up and down. And lastly, we have the hypoglossal nerve, which moves our tongue. So those are the 12 cranial nerves, super, super important nerves of our face. Okay, fun fact number 5. The left side of the human brain controls the right side, and the right side controls the left side. Again, super interesting. Sure, I can go back. Is it this slide that you need? Again, this video will be on the our YouTube channel, so if you need to make more notes, then definitely go to our YouTube channel. So we talked about this, but I also made it a fun fact because I want you guys to memorize it. Are we good to go? Okay, I'm going to... Okay, so now we're going to talk about basically the structure of the eye and how it relates to vision. So we have, first up, eye color. So how eye color is made is it's created by the amount and type of pigment in your iris. Multiple genes are inherited from each parent, and combined, those determine a person's eye color. So we do that through, you're going to learn in biology how we determine a specific trait through different genes from each parent. We have the iris, which is the colored part of the eye. It contains the pigment that makes up your eye color. It covers our pupil and has a sphincter. A sphincter is basically a ring of muscle. So the iris would be kind of the very dark blue part in this diagram. It's covering the pupil, which is that oval thing. And the cornea of the eye is basically a clear dome over the iris. It's the outer part of the eye, and it is covered by the so they're not ovals per se. It's just like we're looking at it from the side. We're not looking at it from the front, so that's why it's looking at us like that. It's actually 3D, not 2D. So I think I have a we'll see. So the pupil, basically what the pupil is, it's a black circular opening in the iris that lets light in. So our pupil actually can dilate and constrict. And our sclera is basically the white part of your eye. So everything surrounding your pupil, your iris, everything, the white part. Okay. Next, we have the conjunctiva, which basically covers your cornea. It's like a thin layer of tissue that covers the entire front of your eye. Oh, sorry, except for the cornea. That's right. So it covers everything but the cornea, because the cornea is the opening of your eye. The pupil is the opening of your eye, and it covers, it covers the, so basically the layers would be the cornea, the iris, and then the pupil is the actual opening which light goes through, and then it hits the rods and the cones, which helps us see. So conjunctiva basically covers the whole thing except for the cornea. The retina is basically the photoreceptor part of our eye. It converts light into electrical impulses, which is eventually sent to our brain through one of our cranial nerves. And the photoreceptors are basically made up of two things, rods and cones. So what rods do is they recept black and white light. So when you see in your room when it's dark, you can still see like the shadow of maybe your closet or a chair or something. So that's basically your rods working in a dim light setting. You see most everything in a black and white light. And our cones recept color. So when something reflects off an object, when light reflects off an object and it hits all of the layers of your eye, it is responded to by our cones, and that is how we get our visual information. And last, we have the aqueous humor. It's basically It's basically the liquid between our iris and our cornea, and it cleans the eye out. It's kind of our natural system of cleaning our eye. We have the lens, which helps focus light on the back of your eye. We have the ciliary body and muscles, which surround the lens. When the ciliary muscles contract or relax, they change the shape of the lens, making it flatter or wider. So basically, the ciliary muscles are kind of like those little brown strands on the top and the bottom of our lens, and they control the shape of our lens. We have the macula, which is actually part of our retina, and it's a small extra sensitive area on the retina that gives you central vision. So it is like the main kind of place where we see everything, where we can see it the clearest. We have the choroid, which basically contains all of the blood vessels in our eye, and it makes up most of the mass and shape of the eye. So it gives us the circular shape of our eye. So the shape of our lens affects what we see because So how do we see? We see because the light is reflecting and it's going through our pupils and it is hitting the back of our eye, and that is being recepted by our cones and rods. So when the lens changes shape, it kind of reflects light, or it kind of controls where the light is going into the back of our eye. So that's how it kind of shapes which area we're looking at. So if I look left or right, that's controlled because our lens is being pulled by ciliary muscles, and that flattens or widens the shape of our lens. I don't know if that makes sense. And then, so the choroid is basically making up the bulk of your eye, giving it the round shape that it has. So we have the vitreous humor, kind of like the aqueous humor. It's a glass-like liquid. It's transparent. It maintains the shape and of our eyes, and it also cleans our eyes. We have the fovea, which is part of the retina. It's in the middle of the macula, so it's kind of like the second part of the retina. It's where the vision is the clearest. It has tons of cones, because again, cones is basically what actually sees the reflections off the objects, and what sees the actual lights and gives us the visual information. So where we have more cones, we have more clearer vision. And on the other hand, we have the optic disc, which is actually a connection to the optic nerve, and you can't see here. It's basically a blind spot. Why do you think there is a blind spot in our optic disc? So I said the vision is clearest where we have a lot of cones. Why would we have a blind spot in our optic disc? Yeah, we don't have any cones there. It's a connection to our optic nerve, and our optic nerve is one of our 12 cranial nerves, and it's sending visual information to our brain. That's right. Our optic nerve carries impulses to the brain. Okay, fun fact number 6. A newborn baby loses about half of his or her nerve cells before it is born. So we have billions in our brain alone. So imagine how much a newborn baby has. So unfocused, when your eyes are unfocused, that would mean that the shape of your lens is being affected, because our lens is basically what's controlling how much focus we have. Okay, now we're going to talk about the structure of the ears. So it can get a little bit complicated, but stay with me. There are a lot of really tiny, small structures that you're going to have to look for in the diagrams. So just look at the labeling on the diagrams. So the outer ear is the part that we can actually see and touch. It contains the ear auditory canal. That's basically the passageway that leads from the outside of our head to our eardrum, which is also called a tympanic membrane. We have the external acoustic meatus, which lets sound in. Meatus is basically a word for any opening in our body. We have the internal acoustic meatus, which is basically a passage, kind of like where the vestibulocochlear nerve, one of our 12 cranial nerves, and the facial nerves, and different arteries can pass from the inside of our skull to structures in the inner ear and the face. So internal acoustic meatus is super, super important because it holds a lot of, it holds 2 of her cranial nerves, the vestibulocochlear and our facial nerves, and it also contains an artery that's super important. And we have the tympanum membrane, which is basically the eardrum, and it is at the very end of the outer ear. So this is kind of where the outer ear is. We have the external auditory canal, and we have the tympanic membrane, which is basically our eardrum. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the auditory ossicle, which basically makes up our middle ear. We have 3 main parts: the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. So they're all connected to each other and they kind of form a chain reaction. So let's talk about them. So the malleus is the first bone. It's attached to our eardrum. And malleus, what does that remind you? What word does malleus remind you of? Yeah, kind of like a mallet. So it basically means hammer. And that is the first bone of our inner ear. Sorry, our middle ear. We have the incus, which is attached to the malleus, and what it means is anvil. So the little orange shape that you see in the second diagram, that's the incus. And lastly, we have the stapes, which is connected to the incus, and it means stirrup. So we have 3 bones all connected together, and they form the auditory ossicles. So eardrum, 3 little bones, and us hearing. That's basically how we hear. So they make up the middle ear. And lastly, we have the inner ear, which is made up of the pharyngotympanic tube. It connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx, the upper throat, and the back of the nasal cavity, basically through our throat. And it makes pressure in the middle ear equal with the air pressure inside of our body. Pressure inside our body is super, super important, which is why when we study medicine, we also study physics. We have the cochlea, which contains corti. That's basically a receptor organ for hearing. It has tiny little hair cells that translate sound into electrical impulses in our brain, and it sends it to our brain. And the little hairs are called stereocilia. They're little hairs that move, and they get sensed by the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it sends impulses to our brain. And this is kind of everything all together: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. Once you kind of get the hang of it, it's not as complicated. But yeah, it can get pretty confusing since everything's so tiny and it's all connected together. Okay. Lastly, we have the inner ear. The vestibule contains othellets. So do you guys remember when I said we have the tiniest bones are in our ear? The tiniest bones in our body are in our ear. Do you guys remember when I said that? Yeah, so those little tiny bones, there's 3 of them, they sense balance and position. Without them, we would not have a sense of balance or position. They respond to changes in the position of our head with respect to gravity. So again, physics. It's also called linear acceleration, but don't worry about that. So basically, tiny otoliths are tiny grains, and they control our sense of balance and position. The inner ear is connected to our cranial nerve number 8, the vestibulocochlear nerve. Fun fact number 7. There are about, I think that's a typo, 13,500,000 neurons in the human spinal cord. Okay, next we have the nose, and then after that we're going to do the skin. The mouth, and then skin, and then we're done. Okay. Super simple. We have the nasal cavity, which is basically a large air-filled space above and behind the nose, basically in the middle of our face. It contains the nasal septum, which divides our nasal cavity into 2 different cavities. It is also known as a fossa. We have our olfactory bulb. Do you guys remember me telling you about the olfactory bulb? I told you guys to remember the word olfactory. We have the olfactory nerve, and we also have the olfactory bulb, all related to our sense of smell. It's involved in olfaction, which is our sense of smell. Olfactory information is further processed in our brain, where it plays a huge role in emotion, memory, and learning. And lastly, we have the olfactory nerve, the first cranial nerve, and it conveys special sensory information related to smell to our brain. Okay. Okay, so we have our tongue. Our tongue is such a, I don't know about complicated, but it's such a web of like different sensory inputs. It's amazing. It kind of looks scary. The diagram looks really weird, but it's super cool. We're going to talk about different sensations and flavors too. So firstly, we have our gustatory cells. They're basically our taste receptor cells, and they are contained in our taste buds. We have our epiglottis, which is basically a leaf-shaped flap in our throat that prevents our food from entering the windpipe and lungs. Epiglottis is super, super important. Who's heard of that before? I'm sure many of you have. Yeah. Super, super important. It keeps us from choking. We have the palatine tonsil, which protects the body against respiratory and gastrointestinal infections. Don't worry about that. Just remember the word tonsil. It's kind of at the sides of our mouth. It's not the main two tonsils that we usually see when we open our mouth. We have our lingual tonsils, which contain B and T lymphocytes, which get activated when harmful bacteria and viruses come in contact with our tonsils. So again, both of our tonsils protect the body against infections. They contain our immune system cells. Not really infections, but harmful bacteria. Okay, and we have the papillae, which are the small bumps on our tongue, and they give our tongue a rough texture, which helps us eat. They also contain our taste buds and temperature sensors. Okay, who's excited for learning about how we sense flavors? Okay, so we have 5 main flavors: sweet, salty, bitter, sour, and umami. So basically this diagram is telling you where do we taste different flavors, where are they detected. So sweet, anything sugary. Salty would be anything salty. Bitter would have a high pH. It would be alkaline. And sour would mean it would have a low pH and it's more acidic. And umami is kind of savory or delicious. It has glutamate proteins, and it's usually contained in glutamate proteins and meats. So umami is mostly used in to refer to East Asian cultures, and it's basically a flavor enhancer commonly added to canned vegetables, soups, and processed meats. So it's called monosodium glutamate, MSG, and that's what gives umami its distinct flavor. So who finds this stuff interesting? Okay, all right, let's move on. You guys don't have to be nice, it's fine. Okay, lastly, skin. We're almost done, guys. Okay, we have different mechanoreceptors of the skin, but I'm just going to go over the main ones. The first one is nociceptors. They're basically alert us to pain and potential damage to the skin by detecting extremes in temperature and pressure. They basically save our skin from being like burned up or chopped off. Very, very important. We have our Merkel cells or discs, which basically sense light touch. We have Ruffini endings, which are filled with liquid, and basically when the shape of the Ruffini endings is changed, we detect deep pressure and high frequency vibrations. Okay, so we're going to talk about Pacinian corpuscles next. I am 100% sure I'm saying corpuscles wrong, but just go with it. They're basically the nerve endings in our skin responsible for sensitivity to vibration and deep pressure. So Pacinian corpuscles are kind of like that blue oval thing that you see in the skin right above the yellow adipocytes in the hypodermis. We have the Meissner corpuscles, which basically are nerve endings. It's kind of like a pod filled with fluid and liquid and protein, and when it changes shape, we feel light pressure. And of course, the nerves around our hair follicles, when our hair moves, we detect light pressure in our hair follicles. Okay, so we're going to discuss sensations next. We're done with the peripheral nervous system. You guys have graduated from the central and peripheral nervous systems. Congratulations. Okay, so now we're going to go over basically what sensations are real quick. So sensations is basically like taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound, the 5 senses. They're basically sensory inputs, specific information relating to our surroundings. Our brain combines, interprets, and acts on this information. Sensations are basically feelings that occur when the brain interprets sensory impulses, and we have 5 general receptors. 5 different receptors. So we have chemoreceptors, photoreceptors, pain receptors, mechanoreceptors, and thermoreceptors. Basically, what chemoreceptors do is that they are sensitive to chemical concentrations, so different concentrations of chemicals that come in contact with our nervous system. They detect tissue damage, so photoreceptors detect tissue damage. Pain receptors respond to different temperatures. Mechanoreceptors respond to changes in pressure and movement. And thermoreceptors is basically when our eyes respond to light energy. Fun fact number 8, the nervous system can transmit nerve impulses as fast as 100 meters per second or even 180 miles per hour. Super cool. Okay, medical roots, like always. Cephalo means head. Cerebello means cerebellum. The roots for the nervous system are pretty easy because they kind of sound a lot like what they actually do and what the structures are called. So like the cerebellum, the root for the cerebellum is the cerebello. And for the cerebrum, we have the root cerebro. And cranial means cranium or skull. Duro means it refers to the dura mater. We have encephalo, which refers to the brain. Kinesio, which refers to movement. Meningio, which refers to the membrane. And meningio, which refers to the meninges, like we talked about the layers of the brain and the spinal cord. And myelo basically means spinal cord. It's a root for spinal cord. So just take 30 seconds to look at these, and then we'll move on to roots and diseases and conditions. Okay. Diseases and conditions of the body. So actually all of what we're going to talk about are diseases and conditions relating to the eyes. There are so many diseases and conditions related to our nervous system because essentially they control everything in our body. So we have amblyopia, which is basically decreased vision in one eye. The brain doesn't process input from this eye and starts favoring the other eye. So in the diagram, you can see that one eye is kind of blurry, but the other one is super clear. So that's what amblyopia is. We have cataracts, which is probably the most commonly found disease condition of the eye. It's basically when gray scar tissue is building up in the cornea and the lens, and what they do is basically they do a little incision and they take out that gray matter, and then you can see clearly again. We have dacryocytosis, again, these are so hard to say, cytitis. It's basically, dacryo basically means like your tear sac or gland. We talked about it earlier when we were talking about the muscular system and the skeletal system. It's basically the inflammation of the tear sac. So that little bump that you see, that's where your tear sac is, and when it gets inflamed, it swells up, just like so. And we have glaucoma, which is a very common condition as well. It's basically when there is damage done to the optic nerve caused by abnormally high pressure in our eyes. Yeah, it can get pretty scary. It's just scarier because when you have something covering your eyes, like when you have cataracts or glaucoma, you can't see. It can cause blindness. So that's really what makes it scary. We have astigmatism, which is basically when your vision lacks focus. The cornea is not shaped properly. So someone was asking earlier why we lack focus sometimes. This is an actual condition. It's basically like normally we would not see those little lines, the little stripes by the lights near the cars. It would just look like normal lights to us. But when you have astigmatism, our vision lacks focus. So it can look blurry. We have myopia, which is basically when close objects appear clearly but far ones don't. So it's also called nearsightedness. And basically, in normal vision, I don't know if you guys can see the diagram, but in normal vision, a light reflects all the way back to the back of your eye, but in myopia, it doesn't do that. So far away objects are more blurrier. We have presbyopia. The root presby kind of relates to people of older age. And presbyopia would be when you lose vision due to older age. We have extropia last. It's basically when one or both of your eyes is turned outward. Okay. Fun fact number 9. A man's brain has 6.5 times more gray matter than a woman's, but a woman's brain has 10 times more white matter than a man's.